Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, our first Response Source webinar of 2020, Facts, Fakes, and Fast News. Delighted that you can all join us live, and of course, the whole webinar will be recorded and sent out to you afterwards. You can join in the conversation at Response Source. You can use the hashtag Facts, Fakes, Fast News. Of course, we're on all the other social channels you'd expect. And if you've got any questions, you can ask them live in the Q&A box on your screen, or you can email us or reach us on one of our other channels. Delighted to say that we're joined by three fantastic panelists today. I'd like to welcome Charlie Beckett, Meban, and Alastair Brian. Good morning, guys.
Good morning. Good morning.
I won't go into too much detail about your backgrounds. They're all on the screen there. But we do have a plethora of knowledge around the media, fact-checking, and the state of fast news and fake news in the media today. And Charlie, I was hoping we could start with you. And if I appreciate we've only got a time-bound webinar, but if we could start with a sense of how we've reached this point of fast news and fake news that we now seem to be experiencing in the media, just for a bit of context.
Yeah, well, I think it's really great you're doing the webinar, because I think this is something that should concern everyone, really, as citizens. We all rely on information to live our lives and to do our work, but of course it is particularly important to anybody working as a communications professional. Doesn't matter if you're in PR or marketing or journalism, we all want our messages to be effective and credible, and there is a real problem. And I think it's become super high level, high profile ever since 2016 with that presidential election, when we first became aware of how algorithms and the internet are driving disinformation, misinformation, the idea of fake news, which in a sense is a bit of a distraction because it makes us think it's just about deliberate fake news that you can somehow solve. And I've spent the last 3 years looking at this, researching it. We had an LSE commission on truth, trust and technology. We published a report last year on the role of artificial intelligence. And I think the big message is that this isn't something that's going to be solved anytime soon. In fact, it's going to get worse before it gets better. We're all aware of this idea of deep fakes, of fake audio and fake videos. It's a systematic problem, but that doesn't mean you can't do something about it. My particular interest is what news organizations and journalists can do about it, and part of that story is, of course, fact-checking, and my colleagues can tell us a lot more about how that works in practice. And we've gone through a little cycle on the idea of fact-checking. I mean, who wouldn't like the idea of truth? Who wouldn't like the idea of trying to correct inaccuracy or lies? But we saw how fact-checking was kind of limited. Firstly, because there's a lot of misinformation to deal with. And secondly, because we can see that even when you fact-check something, people still don't want to change their mind. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. And as we're going to hear, the fact-checkers are becoming a lot cleverer. They're using the same technology that's spreading the garbage, if you like, to try and bring more credibility, more reliability, and more transparency to information. So I think we've got to be careful about panicking completely and giving up. There are things that we can do.
Excellent. I think you raised an interesting point that obviously it kind of shot into the public conscience with the 2016 presidential election, and a certain person constantly using the term fake news. It does seem to be, at least where it gets the most attention, around politics. And I'm just wondering, as maybe Alastair, if we could talk a little bit about what the Ferret does and how you work as a fact checker in relation to investigative news. Is politics where it lives, or is it a broader subject for fake news?
Yeah, I would say, well, probably in terms of how important it is and how effective and potentially damaging it is, politics is the sort of central focus of where a lot of like the sort of research around fake news, and a lot of what we do in fact-checking, is the vast majority of it is political. But I think fake news, in terms, if you think of it in a broader sense, is sort of false information, particularly that's pumped around online from disreputable sources, goes way beyond just politics. I mean, websites like people will have heard of Snopes, for example, which is a fact-checker that's been going for over a decade, that's been fact-checking, they were fact-checking chain emails, for example, and, pictures of sharks in floodwater and all this sort of classic stuff. But I think certainly from our perspective, we found, from a kind of Scottish UK perspective, that the most damaging area of fake news has been within the political sphere.
Yeah, sorry, Pete, carry on.
I was just going to pick up Alan here from FactCheckNI. Within a Northern Ireland context, we have fact-checked kind of like posters put up by charities who are making kind of numerical claims about things that we've kind of tilted our head sideways and gone, is that really that big a number? And we've kind of looked into it, and some of them have changed their posters. We've looked into things that local councils are saying as a council, not as councillors, but just as the actual public body. And I think if we go back, if you kind of remember the flag protests over the flying of the Union flag over Belfast City Hall, there were people sharing photographs at that stage and saying, there's a riot on such and such a street, and it was kind of clear if you put those photographs into Google Images or something, you would be able to find actually that was a different street several years ago, and just the police were then saying, well, there's no riot on that street, we can't find one, and so there are all kinds of things. Much of it eventually comes back to politics, and our local politicians are certainly good for making claims, but it's quite wide, really. And if we were in different countries, if we go to some of the fact-checking conferences, anti-vax kind of stuff would be actually the major, the kind of the worst thing that they're actually trying to tackle, because actually there's real human harm kind of being done, and they're doing all kinds of things trying to kind of fix what's been spread in WhatsApp groups and so on.
So I guess with something like the anti-vaxxers, it's people pushing an agenda. But like Charlie, is there a sense that this is largely due to someone having a purpose that this is happening, or is it people jumping on a bandwagon, people thinking they're being helpful? Like, is there a typical trend in the way that fake news is spreading?
Well, I think my colleagues just made a really good point here, which is, as I said earlier, this is systematic, and it's a very complex system online. You've got some people, it could be politicians who can now communicate directly online. It could be lobby groups, so people who have sort of professionalized disinformation. But it's also, if you like, ordinary citizens who can amplify this bad information. They can spread it, they can give it volume, and that then gets picked up through the algorithms of search engines or social networks. So it is a really complex picture. There's no point if, for example, Alastair corrects one particular statement, how much traffic, how much attention will be given to that correction compared to the original misinformation. And as I said, I think it's going to get worse. In some ways, you can see it getting better. And one of the good things is that while you've got the people who are now doing this deliberately, and it's, as somebody pointed out, it's not just around politics, it's around health, around lifestyle, it's around breaking news, but it's also around kind of longer-term trends. One of the interesting things is the research shows us that where you make an effort, for example, through fact-checking, it may not get the same traffic as the original bad information, but it helps build media literacy. It shows people that you can check the credibility of the content you're getting, and it also helps other organisations like journalists or reputable PRs to get better at promoting their own good information, and also acting as, if you like, part-time fact checkers, people trying to clear up the system a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really interesting point, and there's something that I just want to raise at this point is we did a small survey of journalists just before Christmas, and like the proliferation of fake news and the fact that it's around social media and like the search results and SEO is driving this as a problem is huge for journalists. So this was this was a journalist survey we presented. I think it was like 51% thought that this was a big problem to tackle going into 2020. I'm just wondering, like, Alan, to come to you, just in the setup of FactCheckNI, are you thinking about journalism? Are you thinking about community groups? How are you set up and how are you working in outreach with these different interest groups?
Yeah, from a FactCheckNI point of view, we're a pretty small organisation. There's nobody who works full time. We were started up with a grant, and we kind of we try and keep ourselves going. Some of that comes through research money, some of that comes through training. We're one of the few fact checkers, I suppose, that we split our life in two. One bit's about actually finding claims and checking them. The other bit is about education, whether that's through community groups, through schools, through the wider public, in terms of trying to raise awareness about critical thinking, about the fairly simple things that people can do to actually verify the veracity of some kind of story. So we kind of split in those two ways. I would say, just kind of looking, I suppose we're quite pedantic fact checkers, and we tend to get into things, and definitions are really important. So a lot of us don't like the phrase fake news, though I do kind of understand what it means. And actually, if you think about misinformation and disinformation, about propaganda, about lobbying, it tends to actually, what we bundle into the phrase fake news tends to actually be a whole pile of other motivations behind why somebody shares something. Even sometimes it's just through ignorance. Probably some of the kind of medical stuff that gets shared around, or some of the stuff around 5G, you might say that could also be about technical ignorance. So a whole range of things that kind of inspire us, and literally sometimes we have interns, sometimes it's about kind of 5 or 6 of us kind of working together, actually looking at claims that either we find or people put into us, and then kind of going through them, being careful that we understand what a claim is, making sure that it's something that actually it's not a future. We can't predict, we can't check the future. Often it has to be something that has happened in the past or has been said about now, and we kind of publish the stuff. And if we make mistakes, which occasionally we do, we'll always be very transparent about fixing them and saying what went wrong and trying to learn our lessons.
And are you engaged by media organisations to fact check on their behalf, or do you fact check like retrospectively for them once they publish something?
It tends to be more retrospectively. Occasionally we may have something coming up soon where kind of proactively a radio station has got in touch around Brexit and wants to look at some particular things for a particular date. But unlike, say, I suppose our sister, Full Fact, who kind of work across GB mostly, they would have much closer ties with kind of broadcasters and papers and things. We're on a much smaller scale, and actually our local media market, the BBC, do reality check. Lots of papers were used to have an explainer column. It's now labelled fact check. So the phrase is basically must have currency. But we tend to, occasionally stories will get picked up by the radio or get picked up afterwards, but we don't have any permanent links, though that would be useful. However, I'm sure the journalists on the call will be realising that they don't have a lot of money to pay for things. They would like everything for free, and as a kind of an organisation that needs to find funding, it's kind of a tricky relationship, but we're very happy for people to pick up what we publish and repurpose it and share it.
I guess that's the best way to get the truth out, is to share it as far as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Alastair, is it the same at the Ferret? Because obviously there is the investigative journalism angle alongside the fact checking. So is it more about your own stories, your own editorial time, or is it still reactive to what's going on?
Yeah, I say to an extent one of the issues, because as people don't know, the Ferret is it was an existing investigative journalism platform in Scotland, and very much like FactCheckNI, we got a tranche of funding to start up a fact-checking sort of strand, which I sort of helped set up and then have continued on. We have in the past had a few tie-ins with newspapers, the Daily Record up here, and the Herald, the Sunday Herald, when that existed. We had a regular fact check in there once a week. We also find that particularly the more partisan newspapers will pick up our fact checks we'll pick up and report on our fact checks when it suits them, which can be slightly frustrating, but I suppose it's good in terms of audience and getting your stories out there. I think what's important in fact-checking in general, to make a more broader point, is that one of the problems that fact-checkers have overall is that the people who are likely to come to fact-checking sites are the people that are less likely to be necessarily fooled by false information and are already seeking out that information in the first place. Yeah. So there's a danger that you end up just going to a sort of echo chamber of people who kind of agree with you anyway, or agree with the kind of concept of fact-checking and are very kind of media literate. What we found being really useful about partnering with other media organizations is not that their audiences aren't as media literate, but they're maybe sort of more mainstream news consumers. The Ferret is, while it punches on its weight, it's a relatively small fish in Scotland. So when we partner with the Daily Record, they've got 100,000 plus readership. They have a much broader readership than we do in terms of they've got like a much sort of from people who just buy a newspaper once, who older people might actually buy a newspaper and that's the only consumption of news they have, to people who are like politics junkies who are on everything. So that really helps to kind of spread your message and also bring kind of the concept of fact checking and your particular fact checks to an audience which might not otherwise see them. So that helps us because I think what the Ferret has got, and before the fact checking service started, was we had quite a good reputation in terms of for accuracy already, so we were able to sort of like continue and promote that as we go through the kind of years after the fact checking service started. And
if we could just kind of pick up the elephant that's been hidden under the carpet. Part of this conversation would be kind of during the general election, during one of the general election debates, one of the Tory party Twitter accounts changed its name to FactCheck UK, which was perilously close to FactCheckNI. While we might question the motivation, and let's not get into kind of quite what they were trying to do, but actually it did we gain a few followers out of the back of that? Yes, I think we saw a bit of a boost in people actually checking out some of the fact-checking sites, and so that may or may not have been what they were planning to encourage. Also, we had a bit of an advertising campaign along with Full Fact during the election around kind of simple things that people can do to check the veracity of what they're hearing, and that was a very useful way of kind of getting people involved and being able to kind of hit people. And I think in terms of impact, one of the we have chosen at the moment, we're working with Facebook as a kind of a fact-checking, a way in basically for accredited fact-checkers to debunk things. If a link is shared on Facebook, if we have actually checked it and found it to be negative, it's something we would be doing anyway, but we can kind of register those, and it means when people share those links, they get a warning to say what you're sharing might not actually be true, and that's been a kind of a useful way of certainly upsetting people who believe some of the stories that they're sharing, but it's a way of making a bit more impact in terms of cutting down the amount of stuff that's going viral within inverted commas that is actually we would deem to be pretty suspect. So that's been kind of useful. It does have its downsides. The Facebook stuff isn't kind of perfect, and we can't lodge political stuff because they won't check political speech. But for all the other things that we do anyway, that's a useful way of actually spreading a little bit of the impact of what we find.
Yeah, if I can come in there, I think that's a great example of how you're trying to make this addressing it more as a systematic problem, and there are lots of players in this, and you just mentioned the platforms, the social networks are providing this kind of infrastructure that can allow disinformation to spread. And I think that's important, that it's not always with a fact check that you're trying to reverse somebody's beliefs. That's really hard, especially around politics, or it could be hard around something very personal like the vaccine dispute. But you are trying to show people literally little techniques that they can do, like reverse image search, but you're also getting people to, if you like, sort of change their behavior, getting them to think, for example, how do I identify that something is questionable, but also, for example, this idea of amplification, that you should pause. For example, if you're a journalist and you see something that's blatantly, deliberately, outrageously, provocatively fake, it might actually be best to totally ignore it and not give it further publicity. And I think we've all got to remember that this is all pretty new territory for most people, even so-called experts like journalists. This is kind of we're learning a new kind of etiquette. We're learning a new way of behaving, and I think the process of fact-checking, especially when it's done in the more sophisticated way that we've heard, can at least help to shift people's behaviour and shift the institutions like Facebook and Google, who quite rightly say that people have a right to speak out. That's what makes social media so exciting and why we pay so much attention to it. So I think it's a gradual process. It's not just around the big stories like elections or terror attacks. It's about getting people into good habits, I guess.
Yeah. Sorry, do you think the social platforms should have more of a responsibility to drive that?
Well, I think personally, I mean, I'd be careful about. I don't want to give Facebook or Google some sort of godlike power to decide what is true and what is not. Mm-hmm. But I think the examples we've heard where they should be signalling the credibility of information, then let people make up their minds. But at least give people some sort of indication, some sort of traffic light warning, some sort of bit like food safety, some sort of a description of where this thing came from. And then people can go to fact-checking websites if they want to try and get some sort of reference point. It's been a bit of a wild west. And my colleagues, if you like, are a bit like the U.S. Marshal. They're wading in there trying to sort things out. But in the end, it's about people's behaviour.
And I think anything that the platforms do at the moment is a bit of a drop in the ocean, if we're honest. I think even they would admit that. The volume of what can be checked and flagged is very low compared with what gets shared. But it's a start, and if people occasionally kind of bump into it and it flags up, then actually it's a little bit of education, and it's a little bit of, maybe I should be thinking a little bit more about this. And it helps at least kind of find those rogue sites which kind of just take random articles off newspaper websites, bundle them all together, and then throw in a whole pile of kind of fairly partisan stuff as well, and try to look like it's a proper news site when it's actually just something that's lobbying for one particular thing. So it starts to kind of expose some of that over time. But I think more will have to be done by the platforms, particularly after the US election is likely to. We don't really know what fake news, if you like, sounds like in the UK when you kind of from the general election, when we kind of look at what's probably going to happen this year in the run up to November.
Yeah, I mean the evidence is that the kind of fake news that happened around the 2016 US elections didn't quite happen in the same way, even with the Brexit campaign and with the recent elections. We have to sort of separate. There's always going to be partisan commentary, people who just see the world in a certain way, and that's part of the glory of plural democracy, if you like. There's some evidence that in places like the UK, we've learnt scepticism because we've had a partisan press that has been somewhat loose with the truth in the past. So perhaps British people have a propensity to be a little bit more sceptical, but they haven't necessarily had the tools like fact-checking sites that enable them to then check those instincts and at least try and get a hold on what they should believe or rely upon.
If I could jump in there quickly, and I'm not sure. Be interested to know Alan's view on this as well. But in Scotland, I would say that we have dealt with relatively little of what would be kind of traditionally described as like fake news.
Yeah.
Straight up fake news, which you're mentioning in the US election, and I suppose to a lesser extent has been part of the EU conversation. I would say it's fake news as a word, and I agree with Alan that it's not a word, it's not a phrase we like to use that much, because it sort of creates a sort of bogeyman kind of fake news producer that's in a dark, in a basement somewhere pumping out all this information. Whereas I find the much bigger problem from us has actually been false information from what people would consider to be credible sources. So from politicians from sources that are a bit more accountable. And it's either been that, or it's been false information that's been put out from political activism pages on Facebook, which I think is a big, certainly over the last year or so, 2 years here, has been a massive, there's been a massive increase in the sort of impact of that sort of stuff, because it's completely out with the mainstream media. It never touches the newspaper, a lot of it. It goes straight from activist pages which have massive reaches straight out to their audiences, be that on Twitter or Facebook or on Instagram.
That's right.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think
about WhatsApp and closed groups like that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to kind of do some of that. We looked at the general election. Obviously, the Northern Ireland parties, the main GB ones, rarely make much of an impact in Northern Ireland. Labour don't even stand. So we looked at the manifestos and tried to find some claims. Now, some of them, there were precious few claims in them, because potentially there wasn't so much delivery that they wanted to actually kind of highlight to people. But we tried to find something in each, and actually looked at that, and then fact-checked it. Often we find it to be true, occasionally we find it to be false, and sometimes it's just kind of one maybe I'll throw up on the screen. But is Northern Ireland without funded childcare provision, which actually starts into quite a complicated discussion about, we like to find the definition, what is the definition of childcare, and actually we discover that it's different in different jurisdictions and different regions of the UK. It changes. In Ireland, in the south of Ireland, it's different, and actually the richness of the check is not necessarily the fact that it was not an entirely true claim that was being made, but it's actually the fact that it varies so much across the UK what funded childcare is there, and in a sense the journey towards the answer is nearly more important than the actual was the claim true or false in the end. But it's quite hard sometimes to find these things, and I think people would love if more people kind of came forward with those kind of claims and said, here's something we've heard, is that true? And we'd also love if people would also kind of just tilt their head and kind of raise an eyebrow and go, is that right? As they listen to stuff, because I think often our bodies and our minds tell us that things are a bit suspicious. We humans are well built in the rest of our lives to detect untruth, and people kind of bring over inconvenient truths. So I think we just need to encourage a bit more of that, and it would be great.
I think that's a really important point, which is that and this is something that it shouldn't just be done by fact-checking groups. And I do actually see journalists, for example, people working in think tanks, even some people working in lobby groups, who are trying to give people a bit more context. They're trying to offer up better sources so that you get more transparency, because we live in such a fast news cycle, and social media is so instantaneous that we need more people to ask the second and third question. Where did that fact or that claim come from? Not just to prove whether it's true or false, but to show people, no, you can try at least to get to the data that's a bit more credible, or different data that offers different points of views. I think that's a really vital extra layer that this kind of work can do.
And we work very closely in Northern Ireland with NISRA, the Northern Ireland Stats and Research Agency. I guess it's the local version of ONS. They're kind of sitting on our advisory committee on our board. And so it's been great to actually be able to go back to, because those official stats are very reliable, and if there's ever a problem with them, they're very transparent about where the problem was and fixing them. Having that kind of a relationship has made it much easier to check some of the things that are said, because you do get into kind of survey wars and poll wars, and particularly about business information and industrial stuff. And so it's been great to be able to kind of use those kind of foundations of data, and I think they've been very appreciative of the fact that actually their data is getting out there and being used and being trusted. So that's been quite good from our point of view, working locally.
So is it, I guess, like one of the main things that we're hopefully going to give to our audience is like where you can start, just as a journalist, where you can start to fact check. And I guess that sense of asking that second and third question, where did this come from, finding an official source, is that the best way forward? Is that where we should be going with this?
I suppose if you had three questions to ask, it's where it's from, what's missing, and how do you feel. That was kind of part of the kind of toolkit of stuff we advertised around the election. But largely, I think journalists you understand the nuances of who wrote and produced the message, because that's often, why were you targeted, or who was being targeted by it? What are they not saying? Because often what's not being said is nearly as important as what is being said as to the veracity, or they're just looking at one corner of an issue as opposed to the whole thing. You can hear the echo of Tony Benn if you ask yourself who paid for it, or where was the power behind this. Those are the kind of things that start to help you, I think, get into the context of what might sound like quite a kind of simple claim. And again, are there corroborating sources? What do other people say about this? And the one advantage of social media is that there's huge kind of big brain out there that will, if there's a hole in something, somebody, it may not be the dominant voice, but you'll be able to find people starting to pick holes in an argument or pick holes in a claim, because there's so many experts who do actually know some of those numbers or do know what happened. And so you can start to kind of piece together a bit of a feel for how you would actually start to prove something. But certainly we find, in terms of fact-checking, it takes a long time. It's not a fast process. We're rather jealous of Full Fact, who often like kind of live fact-check question time or Prime Minister's questions and things. Certainly in Northern Ireland, we're not at that stage. But it is quite satisfying when you kind of get to the bottom of something, but often it's very complex. And actually trying to tell the story simply without killing the complexity of the context is I guess, the art of trying to write one up.
And if I could jump in there as well, sorry.
Yeah.
The one thing that we find just purely from speaking, because obviously I know a lot of people on this call are journalists working in media. One thing that I find, particularly with what we might describe as like a Full Fact described as zombie claims, which is these claims that come round and round and round again and again, no matter how many times they're checked, they sort of keep come back. A lot of them start from this quite interesting. If I can use one specific example, we fact-checked, which is just for fun, basically fact-checked a claim on people know the drink Buckfast, which is a tonic wine in Scotland that's kind of famous in Scotland for being related to loads of crime, basically. And we fact-checked this claim.
Fact check coming on.
Yeah, exactly. We fact-checked this claim that 40% of crime was had been 40% of crimes people had said they'd been drinking Buckfast beforehand, and we looked at where it come from, and it was on a website called Lad's Bible, most recently, which people know as a sort of like Lad's kind of content farm thing. And then they linked to the Telegraph, where the actual claim wasn't, and then they linked to the BBC, where it was a slightly different claim. And there's this sort of like this sort of circle of people linking to news websites that then their news, because they had the claim on the site, not either linked to somebody else, they linked to somebody else. And it's sort of like a Chinese whispers type thing, where it kind of goes round and round and round and round. But people aren't ever actually going to the original source. So I would caution people just in general, when you're doing your research, as much as I think there's some really, the mainstream media and media in general, a lot of it's very, very good and it's very reliable, but go beyond just the last media site that mentioned it. You've got to go to the actual original source where it came from.
Yeah, and this has always been a problem. I mean, even pre-internet, there would be a problem where a fact is too good to check. It's too delightful a story to actually, you don't want to double check it. But I think there is a premium. I mean, I say that fake news is good news for good journalists or good communicators, because I think there is a premium to show people that you're a bit smarter. I think people quite enjoy correcting misinformation. They like to feel, something that other people all thought was true is actually rubbish, and they feel better about that, So I think there is an advantage for communicators to be a bit sceptical and sometimes go against the herd or the grain.
Yeah, and yet my local council, if I can get this up on the screen, but my local council advertised that they had 1 million Christmas tree lights in a big display last Christmas or Christmas before last, 2018, and they had press releases and brochures that were handed out to people, and all this talked about there was 1 million. I thought that's an awful lot of lights, and we ended up actually estimating. We counted them. Because it's the work of a primary school. It's the work of a primary school child to basically walk along the length of a street and count how many there are in a metre and then multiply it up. It didn't take more than kind of 20 minutes. And there was about 200,000 if we were generous. And we even kind of asked them, so can you tell us where you got, how you know there's 1 million? And they kind of doubled down. It was kind of very Trump-like in terms of they kind of got very specious and said, of course there's a million. You know. Now, what we realised was we couldn't get any local media to pick this up because, in a sense, they didn't want to destroy the kind of beauty of Christmas. It was too nice a thing. They didn't want to. In fact, we even got some criticism for, why on earth did you look at that? We kind of went, well, as a member of the public, he said, if a council was willing to lie about the number of lights they had, or at least, what else might they accidentally kind of put out there?
Yeah.
And in terms of impact this year, they have a slightly bigger display, and they haven't mentioned the word million in their brochure, so we left them alone. And thank goodness, because it would be more complicated to count this year. But it's even those so simple things, But it was an example. I thought that would be something that local radio programs would be delighted with. No, they wouldn't touch it, and it just felt yeah, it's too close to Santa. There's some things nobody wants to debunk.
Comes across as humbug. It's fair enough. We are unfortunately over time. Thank you everyone who has stayed on. A couple of questions come through, but we'll get those answered. Afterwards. Thank you to our panelists today, Charlie, Alan, and Alastair. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And there are, I've been told to show you this slide with other fact-check services as well. But obviously, all the fact-check services are doing excellent work. And yeah, it's something that is very important, I think, for the future of this industry. So thank you very much, everyone, and until the next time.